For 7 months, Chris Hemsworth brought coffee to an old man every single morning. Black, no sugar, poured into a steel thermos he kept in the side pocket of his backpack. He brought a sandwich too. Turkey Swiss, a little mustard on one side. He left it at the same bench every day at 6:10 a.m. outside the Eastfield Veterans Center on Merchant Street in Boston, before the city woke up and the foot traffic made everything complicated. The old man's name was Raymond Voss, 71 years old. He slept on that bench most nights, or in the covered alcove beside the dry cleaner next door when the rain came sideways off the harbor. He had a military-issue wool blanket that had seen better decades, a duffel bag with a broken zipper held shut by a carabiner clip, and a pair of boots that had been resoled at least twice. Chris had been in Boston for 8 months on a production deal, a limited series shooting at Harbor Studios, 6 months of principal photography followed by 2 months of post-production consulting. He'd rented a ground-floor apartment on Merchant Street because it was quiet, close to the water, and the building manager hadn't recognized him once in the entire first week. He ran at 5:45 every morning along the harbor path, turned back at the old naval dock, and passed the Veterans Center on his way home. The first morning he noticed Raymond, he almost kept running. He'd seen the man before, the way you see a piece of furniture registered, filed away, moved past, a shape under a blanket. Part of the landscape of a city that had more people sleeping outside than anyone in the glass towers downtown wanted to count. Chris had walked past men like Raymond in Sydney and London and New York, and he had told himself the same thing most people tell themselves, that there were systems for this, organizations, programs. Someone else was handling it. He stopped. He looked at the man, really looked, and something about the posture caught him. Even asleep, even folded under a worn blanket on a wooden bench, Raymond Voss held himself with a quality Chris recognized from men he'd known growing up in Bullman, in the Northern Territory. Men who'd worked cattle stations in silence for 30 years and carried that silence in their shoulders even when they were sitting still. Not broken, contained. Chris turned around, walked back to the corner cafe that opened at 5:30 for the early nurses from Mass General, bought a coffee and a wrap sandwich, and left them on the bench next to the sleeping man, tucking the bag against the armrest so the wind wouldn't take it. Raymond was asleep. The next morning, Raymond was awake. He watched Chris approach with the flat, measuring expression of someone who'd been disappointed enough times that kindness registered as a warning before it registered as anything else. Chris set the thermos and the sandwich down on the bench without speaking. He was about to walk away. "You don't have to do that," Raymond said. His voice was rough, the particular roughness of someone who didn't use it much. "I know," Chris said. He started walking. Raymond called after him. "You Ozzy?" Chris stopped, turned. "That obvious?" Raymond almost smiled. "Not quite. Name's Raymond, Chris." Raymond nodded once, the way men nod when they've decided to allow something without fully committing. Chris walked home. The next morning he came back. That was how it started. Not with a grand gesture. Not with a conversation about circumstances or what brought a man to a bench on Merchant Street in October. Just coffee, a sandwich, and 2 people getting used to each other across a small distance. By the second week, it had become a conversation. Short, nothing urgent. The weather, the harbor, whether the Red Sox had any hope left that season. Raymond had sharp opinions on all of it. He spoke carefully, the way someone speaks when they've learned that the words you choose in a room are the ones that get used against you later. Measured, precise, never more than what was needed. Chris noticed things about him without trying to. The way Raymond tracked the entrance to the Veterans Center with his eyes whenever a car slowed on the street. A habit so ingrained he probably didn't know he still did it. The way he folded the sandwich wrapper into an exact square before tucking it in his bag. Same dimensions every time. Same 3 folds, no variation. The slight hesitation before lifting anything with his left hand. Not weakness, but the practiced accommodation of old damage. The kind that had been accommodated so long it had become invisible to everyone except the person carrying it. And one morning in mid-October, this was the thing that stayed with Chris longest. Raymond glanced up at a black SUV idling across the street, clocked the 2 men in the front seats, read the plates, and looked back at his coffee without a word. 2 seconds, total. The men weren't a threat. They were just waiting to pick someone up. But Raymond had run the entire calculation in the time it took Chris to lift his thermos. These were not the gestures of a man who had simply fallen through the cracks. "You served," Chris said one morning in late October. "Not a question." Raymond looked at the harbor. "Long time ago. Which branch?" A pause, long enough to be deliberate. "Army." Then some other things. Chris didn't push. He sat on the far end of the bench with his own coffee, the cold coming off the water hard enough to see your breath. And they sat in the silence of two people who understood that not everything needed to be spoken. Some things required time to become sayable. What Raymond did talk about were the edges of a life. A daughter in Phoenix named Claire he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. He said her name the way you say the name of a place you left under difficult circumstances. A city in Germany, Frankfurt, where he'd eaten the best bread of his life and thought about it for 20 years. A sergeant he'd served under who could walk into a room full of strangers and read every person in it within 30 seconds. Not the surface of them, the actual interior, what they wanted and what they feared. "Could you ever do that?" Chris asked. "Read a room like that?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "when it mattered. No pride, just fact." November came and the temperature dropped hard off the harbor. Chris noticed the wool blanket had developed a tear along the bottom edge, and one morning the wind off the water was working at it with real purpose. He went to the military surplus store on Hanover Street that afternoon and bought a heavy-duty fleece blanket, field-rated, the kind mountain rescue teams use in the Southern Alps on location shoots. He paid cash. He left it folded on the bench the next morning under the thermos. Raymond looked at it for a long time without touching it. Long enough that Chris started to wonder if he'd overstepped. "You're going to make this difficult," Raymond said finally. "Make what difficult?" Raymond didn't answer directly. He pressed one hand flat against the fleece, testing the weight and warmth of it, and then folded it over his lap the way a man handles something he intends to keep. "Thank you," he said. It came out like something retrieved from a distance. The bench became a fixed point in Chris's days. The one thing that happened the same way every time, regardless of what the production schedule threw at him. Late call sheet, early wrap, 17-hour edit session. It didn't matter. 6:10 a.m., Merchant Street, thermos, sandwich, 10 minutes. There was a young woman who worked the early opening shift at the cafe where Chris bought the coffee each morning. Her name was Jody Marsh, 24 years old, putting herself through a nursing program at Boston University on a combination of scholarships and weekend shifts. She'd figured out within the first week what Chris was doing with the second coffee, and she'd started having it ready before he reached the counter. She never said anything about it. She just slid it across with a small nod and charged him for both. One morning in late November, she leaned over the counter as he was leaving. "He was awake at 4 this morning," she said quietly. "I saw him from the bus. He was just sitting there in the cold." She paused. "I don't know if that's useful information. I just thought you'd want to know." Chris looked at her. "How long have you been watching out for him?" She shrugged. "Couple months. I can't bring him coffee. Against the terms of my scholarship housing. No guests, no deliveries. Stupid rule." She went back to wiping down the counter. "But I can tell you things. That was Jody." She started texting Chris the mornings she spotted Raymond at unusual hours, 3:47 a.m., 4:22 a.m. And the mornings Raymond wasn't there at all, which began to happen with increasing frequency as December wore on. But here is where the story takes a turn no one saw coming. One morning in mid-December, Raymond wasn't at the bench. Not at 6:10, not at 6:30, when Chris waded through 2 buses. The cardboard was gone. The duffel bag was gone. Even the faint impression in the wooden slats where Raymond always sat had been rained flat. Jody's text came at 6:45. Not there last night either. Checked it close. Chris stood on the empty sidewalk with the thermos in his hand and the cold coming off the street in waves. He told himself Raymond had moved to a shelter for the winter. He told himself that was the good outcome. He almost believed it. Almost. He went to the Veterans Center when it opened at 9. The intake coordinator, a woman named Dee Callahan, whose lanyard said she'd been with the facility for 11 years, typed Raymond's name into her system, waited, shook her head, no record. She tried the broader VA database, typed waited, leaned closer to her screen. "There's a Raymond Allen Voss in the federal system," she said slowly. "Date of birth 1953. She scrolled. Her expression changed, a tightening around the eyes. His file is substantially redacted. Almost everything past the initial service dates is blacked out. Which hospitals would take him if he collapsed on this street? Chris asked. She told him. It was Tufts Medical. Chris found out within the hour and went in person. The veterans advocate at Tufts was a man named Ben Hartley, early 30s. 2 tours in Kandahar, now working hospital intake because he knew from the inside what falling through the cracks looked like. He listened without interrupting while Chris explained the bench, the 7 weeks of mornings, the restricted file. Then Hartley said, "How committed are you to making this right? Tell me what it takes." Raymond had come in 4 days ago. Hypothermia compounded by a cardiac event. He was stable, but without verified VA benefits authorization, the hospital was obligated to transfer him to county overflow within 48 hours. His record is classified in a way the standard intake channels can't process, Hartley said. Getting the VA's classified accounts division to authorize benefits can take months. He paused. And here's what should make you angry. His benefits weren't lost by accident. Someone in the regional VA office processed a 2009 review and manually flagged his file inactive, without ever attempting contact. One administrator, 11 minutes, 23 years of service, gone. Chris set down the paper cup in his hand very carefully. Who? Hartley shook his head. That's above what I can do, but it's in the audit trail. I have a contact, Chris said. Give me a day. The contact was a retired Army general named Patricia Drummond, whom Chris had met at a veterans charity dinner in Sydney 3 years earlier. He'd helped raise money for her foundation, quietly, the way he preferred to do things, and she'd given him her personal number and said use it if it matters. He'd never used it. He called her now. She listened without interrupting. Give me the name and the file reference number, she said. He gave her both. The VA authorization came through 43 hours later. Raymond was moved to a private room at Tufts Medical Center, Ward 7, on the morning of December 19th. When Chris walked in that first time, Raymond was propped against pillows with an IV in his arm and a cardiac monitor producing its small, steady argument that he was still here. He looked smaller in the white room, more exposed. He opened his eyes when Chris pulled a chair close, and something cycled through his expression before settling. You called in a favor, Raymond said. A small one, don't minimize it. He looked at the ceiling. I knew a general once who owed me a favor for 20 years. I never called it in. A pause. Thought it would last forever. Foolish. Chris said nothing. The monitor beeped. Outside the window, Boston moved through its afternoon without pausing for the specific weight of this room. I wasn't always like this, Raymond said. Not an apology. A fact stated for the record. I know that. No. Raymond turned and looked at him directly. The same calibrated attention he'd used on the black SUV 6 weeks ago. I don't think you do. Not yet. He reached under his pillow and produced an envelope. Sealed, plain white, an address written on the front in deliberate handwriting. He held it out. If something happens to me, Raymond said, I need you to send this. Chris took it. The envelope was heavier than paper should be. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me the actual thing, not the comfort. I promise. Raymond nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has put something in order. He settled back against the pillows. Some weight had shifted. He closed his eyes, and Chris sat with him until the evening nurses arrived, the envelope in his jacket pocket, its weight something he could feel each time he breathed. Chris visited twice a week through January. Thermos, same as always, and books Raymond never read but liked having on the nightstand. They talked about the harbor, the Red Sox, and a military surplus store in Frankfurt that Raymond had visited in 1987 and said was the finest he'd ever seen. It was on a Tuesday in late January, 11:14 in the morning, the winter light flattened white through the hospital window, that Raymond gave Chris a second thing to carry, a notebook, small, leather-covered, worn at the corners. The pages were dense with handwriting set down at different times and different states of urgency, some entries slow and careful, others rapid, almost frantic, as though whoever was writing them wasn't certain how much time they had. My memory goes in and out, Raymond said, with no particular emotion attached to the fact. I wrote down the things that are true. Chris turned through the pages, dates, coordinates that didn't correspond to any geography he recognized, names without context, strings of numbers that might have been frequencies or case codes, occasional sentences in a language that wasn't foreign but operational. built for transmission rather than reading. What do you want me to do with it? Keep it. If anyone ever asks what was real, you'll know. He said it the way you say a thing you've finished with. Hand it off, settled. Chris held the notebook for a moment. He turned to the last page that had writing on it. The entry was dated February 19th, less than 2 weeks ago. It was only 4 lines. The harbor is east of here. I can hear it at night when the ward is quiet. I have been trying to remember the exact sound of the Elbe River in Frankfurt in winter. I cannot, but I remember the bread. Chris closed the notebook. He put both in his jacket pocket. 2 pieces of a shape he couldn't see yet. This is the moment to tell you something about Chris Hemsworth that the story requires you to understand. He grew up in Bowman, in the Northern Territory, from the age of 9 to 13, a cattle station in the deep outback, 40 kilometers from the nearest sealed road, surrounded by floodplains and silence, and the kind of landscape that teaches you either to read it or to be lost in it. His father worked with the land managers. Chris spent those years learning to track animals across dry creek beds, to read weather and the way the cattle moved before it arrived, to sit still in the heat for hours watching a waterhole, because stillness was how you saw things that didn't want to be seen. He carried that into everything, into sets, into auditions, into the way he'd stood at a bench in October and looked at a man sleeping under a blanket and seemed contained rather than defeated, into the way he'd noticed the sandwich wrapper folded in thirds, the SUV calculation, the left-hand hesitation. Small signals most people's eyes slid over because most people's eyes were tuned for what was loud. Raymond had spent his career reading rooms. Chris had spent his childhood learning to read the land. They'd arrived at the same skill from entirely different directions. That was why they could sit together in silence on a bench without either of them feeling the need to fill it. He still had the habit of carrying a small notebook in his left breast pocket, a habit that started in Bowman, with a station hand's cattle tracking book that had since worn to nothing. Some things you keep because putting them down would require an explanation you're not ready to give. Raymond Allen Voss died on a Friday morning in early March. The facility called Chris at 7:22 a.m. He lay still after he hung up, the phone on his chest, the ceiling above him offering nothing. Then he got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the Merchant Street apartment, and let the grief settle into him without fighting it. He collected Raymond's belongings that afternoon, the fleece blanket folded with the same precision Raymond applied to everything, 3 shirts, the duffel bag with the broken zipper, the notebook, and at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, a second envelope addressed to Chris in Raymond's handwriting. He sat in his rental car in the facility parking lot and opened it. Inside was a photograph, black and white, the quality of something scanned from a decades-old original. Raymond in a dress uniform, younger, his face unlined, 3 rows of service medals across his chest. On either side of him stood 2 men in expensive suits. Chris recognized one of them from old news coverage, Senator David Alcott, Armed Services Committee, retired 4 years ago after a long career in defense policy. The other man had the specific bearing of someone who'd moved through secure rooms for so long that authority had become the way he occupied space. On the back of the photograph, 4 words in Raymond's handwriting. He saw me first. The letter ran 3 pages, notebook paper, Raymond's precise script. It was addressed to Colonel Margaret Slade, Pentagon, Office of Inspector General. Chris read it in the parking lot as the afternoon light faded around the car. Raymond wrote that he had spent 23 years doing necessary things in places that could not be mentioned, for people who would deny knowing him if the wrong question was asked. He wrote that the country had made promises when it sent him into those places, and had not kept them. The last 8 years had been hard. He said he knew his file had been flagged inactive in 2009 by someone in the Northeast Regional VA office, that he had gone in person in 2011 and again in 2014, and been turned away both times. He had the names. Then he wrote about the bench on Merchant Street, about a man who stopped, about 7 months of coffee and sandwiches and 10 minutes every morning in the cold, and a phone call made on his behalf to a general whose number most people in that situation would never have. He wrote, "I know what it costs to do the right thing in a room where nobody's watching. I spent 23 years learning that. He has it. He saw me first. I'm leaving this with you because I don't know what else to do with it." He signed it, Raymond Allen Voss, GS-14 retired. Attached behind the letter paper-clipped were 2 additional sheets. Names. Dates. 2 visits to the Northeast Regional VA office. March 2011, September 2014. The name of the administrator who had turned him away both times in Raymond's deliberate block capitals. Sandra Pruitt, Benefits Coordinator, Northeast Regional. And below that, her supervisor, the man who had signed off on the 2009 review that flagged Raymond's file inactive in the first place. Harlan Cole, Regional Director, VA Northeast. Chris drove to the Commonwealth Avenue post office the next morning. He stood in line for 18 minutes. When he reached the counter, he slid the envelope across. The clerk weighed it, stamped it, tossed it into a bin with 100 other letters. It disappeared into the pile. Chris walked out into the cold Boston morning and told himself that was the end of his part in it. He was wrong. In the weeks after Raymond's memorial service, held at the Braxton facility on a Tuesday afternoon, attended by Chris and 2 nurses and a chaplain who had never met Raymond and said generic words about service and sacrifice, Chris went back to the bench on Merchant Street twice. He stood there with a coffee in his hand and thought about a sealed envelope sitting somewhere between Boston and Washington, D.C., one of 10,000 letters mailed that morning, indistinguishable from all the rest. He thought, it will go into a file somewhere. That will be the end of it. He finished the production. He packed up the apartment on the last day of April. He flew home to Byron Bay. In May, standing in his kitchen, the afternoon light coming off the Pacific in long, flat sheets, his phone rang with a Washington area code he didn't recognize. He answered, Mr. Hemsworth. A woman's voice, clipped, professional, and underneath both of those things, carrying the weight of someone who had been carrying it for a long time. My name is Colonel Margaret Slade. I'm the Deputy Inspector General for the Department of Defense. I received a letter from Raymond Voss. Chris set down the glass in his hand. He asked me to send it. I know. I've read it 4 times. A pause. Mr. Hemsworth, Raymond included documentation in that letter. Names, dates, administrator records from 2009 and 2 in-person denials in 2011 and 2014. That documentation opened an audit that has now confirmed 31 cases identical to Raymond's. Veterans with classified service records whose files were flagged inactive without contact, without due process, by the same regional office. Chris was very still. The same people, Slade confirmed. Sandra Pruitt and her direct superior, Regional Director Harlan Cole, have been placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of my office's investigation. I'm going before the Senate Armed Services Committee in June. I want you there. I want you to speak about Raymond, about what you saw, about what one man's decision to trust you with that envelope has now set in motion. I'm not a veteran, Chris said. I'm not a policy expert. I know exactly what you are, Slade said. Raymond's letter was very clear, and that is precisely why I'm asking. The hearing was June 14th. Chris flew commercial from Sydney, middle seat, no upgrade, no staff. The leather notebook was in his carry-on. The photograph was in his breast pocket. Slade's team had booked him into a privacy suite at the Willard Intercontinental 2 blocks from the White House. Thick carpets, a view over Pennsylvania Avenue at night. He sat at the edge of the bed in his jeans and a faded cotton shirt and thought about Raymond on the bench. He went to sleep early. In the Senate Armed Services Committee room the next morning, Slade testified first. She laid out the institutional failure in language so precise it almost didn't feel like a condemnation until you added it up. Then she laid out what the audit had found. The investigation identified Sandra Pruitt, former benefits coordinator at the VA Northeast Regional Office, as the administrator responsible for flagging 31 classified service veterans' files as inactive between 2007 and 2015, Slade said. These actions violated 38 CFR Section 3, 103. She was not acting alone. Regional Director Harlan Cole co-signed the 2009 review that initiated the practice. Both have been referred to the Department of Justice. Senator Alan Briggs of Massachusetts leaned forward. General, are we saying this was deliberate? We are saying it was systematic, Senator. Whether it was deliberate indifference or active negligence, that is now a question for the Department of Justice. The room went very quiet. In the gallery, Jody Marsh sat in the 3rd row. She'd bought a standby ticket at 11 p.m. the night before and flown down from Boston on her own. She texted Chris from the security line, row 3. Go get him. 3 witnesses testified before Chris was called. The first was a man named Earl Givens, 66, former Army Special Operations. He had applied for VA healthcare benefits 11 times between 2008 and 2019. 11 denials, each citing insufficient service documentation. He had been living in a single-room hotel in Hartford, Connecticut, on $814 a month. He read from one page of notes in a voice that did not shake. When he finished, he folded the paper precisely and put it in his breast pocket. The second witness was a woman named Diane Forsyth, 58, former Navy intelligence analyst. She described arriving at the VA Northeast Regional Office in August 2013 with her service record, discharge papers, and a letter from her commanding officer. Sandra Pruitt had looked at the documents and said, in front of 2 other veterans in the same waiting room, that she couldn't verify a record she wasn't authorized to see. Diane said she'd been coming back for 3 years. Pruitt said she suggested a different approach. Diane had driven 2 hours to get there. She drove 2 hours home. The third witness was a retired intelligence contractor named Morris Webb, 70 years old. He had known Raymond Voss. Briefly, an overlap in the early 1990s on an assignment he couldn't name. He said he had known about the benefits denial for years and had said nothing because of an NDA he wasn't certain had expired and because the system had made clear that people like him were not supposed to make noise. He was speaking now because Raymond Voss was dead, and because a man he'd never met had mailed a letter for him, and because some debts could only be paid in testimony. Then Chris was called. He walked to the witness table and sat down. The room had a specific stillness, the kind that accumulates after 3 people have told the truth and the air hasn't settled yet. Mr. Hemsworth, Senator Briggs began, you knew Raymond Voss personally. Can you describe that relationship for the committee? I met Raymond in September of last year, Chris said. He slept on a bench on Merchant Street in Boston. I ran past him every morning for about 2 weeks before I stopped. He let that land. I brought him coffee and a sandwich. I kept doing it for 7 months. Why? Chris looked at the notebook in his hands. Because he was there, he said. And because something about the way he held himself told me he'd been somewhere important and that nobody had told him it mattered. Senator James Whitfield of Texas, older, a skeptic's deliberate squint, spoke up. Mr. Hemsworth, with respect, you're a wealthy actor. Are we here to take lessons in generosity from someone for whom generosity is considerably less costly than it is for most Americans? The room held its breath. Chris looked at Whitfield for a long moment, not performing patience, just looking. I don't think you've understood what I'm here for, he said. His voice was level and unhurried. I'm not here to be applauded for a sandwich. I'm here because Raymond Voss flew intelligence assets out of hostile territory in operations that your committee voted to classify. He came home with injuries documented in a file so sealed that a VA intake coordinator couldn't read most of it. He tried to access his benefits in 2011 and again in 2014. He was turned away both times by a coordinator who has now been referred to the Department of Justice. He set the notebook on the table. I brought him coffee. You, this institution, made him a promise when you sent him into danger. He tried to collect on it twice and was told to try a different approach. He paused. I kept my promise with a thermos and $6 a day. I'd like to understand what happened to yours. Senator Whitfield opened his mouth, closed it. Senator Briggs leaned forward. Mr. Hemsworth, in your view, is this fixable? It has to be, Chris said, because what happened to Raymond didn't require cruelty. It only required indifference, and indifference is harder to fight than cruelty. Indifference has no face, no name, no room to be held accountable in, unless someone walks in carrying names and dates. He looked around the room. Raymond Voss held himself with more dignity on that bench in the cold than most people manage in a heated office. What the system took from him wasn't his dignity. It was everything else. The bed, the care, the recognition that what he gave was real and owed something in return. He paused. They all deserve better. Every single one. Senator Whitfield did not ask another question. The hearing ended. The consequences came fast. Sandra Pruitt was terminated from federal employment on July 3rd, effective immediately under Section 7513 of Title V, misconduct and dereliction of duty. The termination letter cited 31 specific cases, a pattern spanning 8 years, and the knowing co-signature of a superior. She was barred from future federal employment. Her federal pension was reduced by 40% under misconduct provisions, a reduction of $14,380 per year. Harlan Cole, regional director, resigned on July 11th, 4 days before the Department of Justice was expected to announce the scope of its inquiry. His resignation letter was 3 sentences long and contained no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was not accepted as a shield. On August 7th, the DOJ announced a formal investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 and 38 U.S.C. Section 5905. False statements to federal agencies and obstruction of claimants' rights. Cole retained private counsel the same afternoon at a retainer reported to begin at $40,000. The VA Northeast Regional Office was placed under direct federal oversight. An independent auditor, Harmon and Reed Associates, contracted at $2.3 million was appointed to review every benefits denial issued between 2005 and 2023. A Sunday feature in a Washington publication ran the headline, "How Two VA Administrators Erased Dozens of America's Most Classified Veterans." It was shared 1 million times in 72 hours. Senator Whitfield issued a written statement 3 days after the hearing, 4 sentences, no mention of Raymond Voss by name, a spokesperson describing the testimony as a valuable perspective from the private sector. He voted yes on the Fletcher-Voss Veterans Accountability Act on July 9th, margin of 87-13, and did not comment on the record about his vote. The Sunday feature quoted 3 of his former staffers by name. He did not respond. In the corridor outside the hearing room, Jody Marsh found Chris before the security escort could close the gap. She was still in her nursing program scrubs under the jacket she'd worn on the plane. "You were good in there," she said. "He deserved better than good," Chris said. They stood in the corridor for a moment. 2 people who had shown up for the same man from completely different distances, both doing the only thing available to them. "He talked about you, you know," Jody said. "The last few weeks at the facility, he asked the nurses if they'd ever seen anyone just stop on a street and decide to give a damn." She looked down the corridor. He said it like it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. She walked away before he could answer. The Fletcher-Voss Veterans Accountability Act established mandatory communication protocols between classified service archives and VA Benefits Administration, required annual audits of inactive classified service accounts, and created a rapid response team for veterans severed from their records. A housing fund seeded with $430,000 was established under Raymond's name in Boston, providing transitional housing to veterans within 48 hours. No documentation required on arrival. Journalists who traced the donation found it had originated from a financial instrument registered in New South Wales, Australia, and stopped looking there. Jody Marsh finished her nursing program in August and was hired at Tufts Medical Center, Ward 7, the same ward where Raymond had spent his last weeks. She texted Chris on her first day, back where it started. He texted back, he'd have liked that. The bench on Merchant Street was fitted with a small brass plaque, Raymond Allen Voss. He was here. He mattered. Chris was back in Byron Bay when they installed it. He saw the photograph on his phone at 6:09 in the morning. Morning light on the brass, a paper coffee cup beside it. He held the phone for a long time, then put it in his pocket, walked out to the water, and paddled out before the sun was fully up. The Pacific was cold and gray and indifferent the way only very large things can afford to be. He sat on the board and let the swells move under him and thought about a man who had spent 23 years doing necessary work in invisible places and then 8 more years on a bench in plain sight, waiting for someone to treat his existence as worth responding to. Someone had stopped. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. A thermos of black coffee and a turkey sandwich, 7 months, no ceremony, no audience, a phone call, a promise kept, a letter mailed from a post office on Commonwealth Avenue, and then 31 men and women found, and then hundreds more, and then a law. It started with the smallest possible thing. Raymond had written it in his letter. He saw me first. That was the only thing he'd asked. Not rescue, not transformation, not the grand intervention of someone with means. He had asked only to be seen, to have someone stop in the early morning and recognize, without needing it explained, that his presence on that bench was something other than furniture. A wave came. He turned the board and paddled into it, the familiar surge, the shore coming up fast. Then the wave released him, and he was still again, the water moving with its ancient indifference. He thought, I kept my promise, Raymond. Then he paddled back out to wait for the next one. Raymond Voss served his country for 23 years in operations that remain classified to this day. He deserved better. What he received was a bench and a broken zippered duffel bag, and one person who decided to stop when everyone else kept walking. Sometimes dignity starts in the smallest possible place. Sometimes one person choosing to see another is the first stone that moves an avalanche. There is someone near you who needs to be seen, not rescued, not fixed, just seen. What you do next is yours to decide. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. We read every single one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit like and subscribe so you're here when the next story arrives. The world has more Raymond Vosses than it knows what to do with. The question is whether it has enough people willing to stop. This is a fictional dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. Chris Hemsworth is portrayed in a fictional scenario consistent with his known public character and values. All supporting characters, institutions, events, and organizations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI-assisted.